Well, we are going to move here now to the U.S. Congress and the ongoing attempts to push forward this new Cold War through the lens of social media. There was a big hearing on the Hill. I guess it was last week, earlier this week. My mind is losing me here, but recently it took place. There was a hearing. If you maybe missed it, there are a number of notable moments, but we have a clip of one of the more notable viral moments, which I think will give you a sense of how the whole thing went.
Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
Yes, and I served my military for two and a half years in Singapore.
Do you have any other passports from any other nations?
No, Senator.
Your wife is an American citizen. Your children are American citizens.
That's correct.
Have you ever applied for American citizenship?
No, not yet.
Okay. Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
Have you ever been associated or affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party?
No, Senator. Again, I'm Singaporean.
Let me ask you some.
Before I say too much to discuss all of this, let's bring in Amanda Yee, who is a journalist and managing editor of Liberation News. Amanda, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks again for having me. It's great to be back.
Well, it's always great to have you. I guess, let me just ask your thoughts. I mean, what do you think about that exchange and what it represents?
Well, the Senate hearing was last Wednesday, January 31st. And right after the hearing, I saw that particular clip of Tom Cotton circulating on social media. And I really thought it was an old clip, and I couldn't figure out why it was going viral, because I really thought this was a clip from last year's TikTok House hearing, in which they brought out the CEO of TikTok, and they kind of regaled him with all these sorts of different types of questions, basically connecting him to the Communist Party of China, and asking him about his thoughts on the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, asking him about the situation in Tibet. But, I was surprised that this was actually a separate hearing. It was the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing entitled Big Tech and the Online Child Sexual Exploitation Crisis. Xu Zhiqi, who's the CEO of TikTok, he was one of a handful of big tech CEOs who were brought before this hearing to testify before the Senate committee. And it was basically a hearing in which, in the audience, there were family members of children who had been victims of this kind of harmful content that is being pushed by social media. And some of these children had been victims of sexual predators online. Some of them had been driven to suicide due to their being fed content which promoted suicide. Some had developed eating disorders because that's what they were getting fed through their feeds, right? And so it's basically a kind of political theater where the capitalist class pretends to go after these big tech companies in lieu of passing any kind of comprehensive privacy legislation and really properly regulating the industry. And so they brought the CEO of TikTok to this hearing to be questioned, but they also brought the CEO of Snapchat. They brought the CEO of Meta, Mark Zuckerberg. They brought the CEO of Discord, and they brought the CEO of X, the new one, not Elon Musk, but the new one. So, it was kind of a way to advance this new Cold War on China. But there are actually a couple of different far-right agendas that was being pushed through this. One of it, which is, as you can see, was the McCarthyite fear-mongering around China and the tech war against it. But basically central to this hearing was this piece of legislation called the Kids Online Safety Act. And it's a piece of legislation that would basically regulate the type of content that companies can show minors online. And it grants the Federal Trade Commission and state attorneys, like, basically any kind of general power to enforce these rules as laid out by the Kids Online Safety Act. So the bill would create kind of a duty for social media platforms to prevent and mitigate any kind of harm to minors, including censoring content that would promote self-harm, suicide, eating disorders, substance abuse, and sexual exploitation. And it would mandate tech companies to limit access or allow minors to opt out of certain features, like opt out of automatic video playing and opt out of like certain algorithmic recommendations. And the bill would legally obligate tech platforms to prevent the promotion of content about certain topics such as suicide, eating disorders, and self-harm. And this bill is actually like pretty controversial because, like a lot of legislation that's presented as a way to protect children and families, it's actually being used as this kind of Trojan horse that's intended to target LGBTQ people. So a lot of online rights advocates that this measure would disproportionately restrict LGBTQ content and categorize it as as sexual content that's inappropriate for children. And this, like, LGBTQ content currently is already, regularly shadow banned on these kinds of social media platforms. And some have also argued that this bill would also censor educational content about racism, like under the claim that that type of content negatively impacts kids' mental health. And so, this is a bill that is pushed and co-sponsored by Marsha Blackburn, who has been very vocal about being like anti-LGBTQ. And also, if you look at the bill's endorsers, you definitely get a sense that there is an underlying agenda here, right? Among the bill's endorsers are the American Principles Project, which is a right-wing think tank that opposes same-sex marriage. It opposes the teaching of critical race theory and LGBTQ content in schools. And the objective of that think tank is to eliminate trans healthcare entirely, right? And so in the bill's current form, it's also endorsed by right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which in September of 2022 released a report entitled, like, How Big Tech Turns Kids Trans, right? And so the Heritage Foundation actually objected to an earlier form of this bill in September of 2022, and it stated that it didn't go far enough in restricting LGBTQ content. And it's also endorsed by like other far-right groups like the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, which is this Christian fundamentalist group that has campaigned against LGBTQ rights and sex education in schools. It's endorsed by the America First Policy Institute, which, like, given its name, you can kind of guess how it stands on LGBTQ rights and trans rights. So there's like a couple of different far right agendas being pushed here. One important thing to note is that this kind of war that's being manufactured by the far right, and how it's being used as a wedge to divide the working class, that agenda is actually deeply unpopular among Americans. And a lot of Americans are more concerned with like economic issues like inflation, skyrocketing rent and basic necessities, sending billions of dollars to fund a genocide in Gaza, that those are the issues that they're really concerned about. And so the culture war agenda pushed by the far right isn't really working. So they're resorting to these like more oblique kinds of attacks that don't really look like they're targeting LGBTQ people, but in fact, that's their purpose and goal. So in addition to like the McCarthyite theater, there is like an additional like far right agenda being pushed through these congressional hearings.
Well, I appreciate you breaking that all down. I'm actually curious because I don't know the answer to this. I'm reminded of a couple months ago, Nikki Haley said the most insane thing with regard to TikTok, because it kind of just seems like they're just kind of throwing whatever's out there and seeing what sticks, like at least for the public to follow. Like you said, they have to like sort of hide this stuff and this other rhetoric. So I'm just gonna quote her because it was so crazy. It actually had to do with Gaza. She said back in this is December, so just not that long ago, "We really need to ban TikTok once and for all, and let me tell you why. For every 30 minutes that someone watches TikTok, every day they become 17% more anti-Semitic, more pro-Hamas based on doing that." I like that that was such a specific number. Like, she literally just made that up. Like, it wasn't even like some right-wing study that they came out and they were like, "We found that people are 17." She just completely fabricated this number. But I'm curious if this bill does anything to refer to like the whole, weaving together the anti-Semitism, anti-Israel stuff with the anti-China stuff. I have no idea if it does or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I watched like the whole hearing was like several hours long, so I couldn't watch all of it, but I watched the parts where the CEO of TikTok, Xu Zhiqi, right? And one of the people that interrogated him was Lindsey Graham, right? And how the TikTok representative in Israel resigned recently because supposedly, this was his claim that TikTok spreads pro-Hamas content and the app is being used to help people destroy the Jewish state. That's a quote from Lindsey Graham, that TikTok is being used to help people destroy the Jewish state. So last year we had this like all this Red Scare propaganda around China, but now since October 7th, we've had a different Red Scare emerging, where basically if you don't completely fall in line with Israel and Israel's genocide in Gaza, that marks you as a terrorist sympathizer. So it was really interesting to see like people like Lindsey Graham at this congressional hearing kind of merge the two Red Scares into one, like the China Red Scare with the new anti-Semitism Israel Red Scare. But yeah, I mean, the hearing itself was very similar to what we saw in March, right? With a lot of the same kind of questioning. The CEO had to field the same questions about him being from China. Like, there were members of Congress who would repeatedly ask him, are you a member of the Communist Party of China? Are you a citizen of China? Do you intend to become a citizen of China? And he like basically responded the same every time. Like, no, I am from Singapore. I live in Singapore. I was born in Singapore. And I guess not a lot of people are familiar with the fact that Singapore is an entirely different country. Like, it's not China. It's actually like its own separate country, 2,000 miles south of China and like surrounded by Malaysia, right? And, just like, the hearings last March, he had to field questions about him, his thoughts on the supposed Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang, what he thought about the Tiananmen Square protests. There was someone who asked him if he agreed that Xi Jinping was a dictator. And, one of the more viral moments that came out of last year's hearing was just like the basic lack of knowledge that these Congress members displayed in terms of like how apps work, how technology worked, how algorithms work, right? If you remember, there was a clip going viral last year of Representative Richard Hudson from North Carolina asking Chu if TikTok could access your home Wi-Fi or other devices connected to the home Wi-Fi network, right? This time, Senate members demonstrated the same lack of understanding of how these apps work. One example of this was during his questioning, Ted Cruz accused TikTok of repressing content that was critical of China by like selectively comparing, these completely unrelated hashtags and how they were trending over select periods of time, right? So Cruz's argument was predicated upon comparing hashtags for the Hong Kong protests, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, and Xinjiang, and comparing those hashtags to hashtags for Taylor Swift, and then accusing TikTok of repressing the former because they hadn't achieved like the same level of like virality as Taylor Swift over this like very specific period of time. And that was his evidence that like TikTok was deliberately trying to repress content that was critical of China, right? And Chu also had to like field these different allegations from people like Josh Hawley, who's one of these like really vocal America First isolation, been salivating over a war with China for a really long time. Fields more questions that China was able to access American user data through this app, right? Hawley accused TikTok of being basically an espionage arm for the Chinese Communist Party. Hawley said, like every single one of these Americans are in danger from the fact that TikTok tracks their employees, TikTok tracks their app usage, TikTok tracks their location data. And he said, we know that all of that information can be accessed by Chinese employees who are subject to the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, right? So obviously there are a lot of serious questions to be had about like data privacy and the way that algorithms push what we see on social media. But this singling out of Chew and TikTok in particular, and baselessly alleging that the CPC harvests American users' data and that it dictates the content on our feeds, that's just nothing more than Red Scare propaganda.
Yeah, no, 100%. One quick thing before we'll let you go, Amanda. I mean, one other element of this vis-a-vis sort of the U.S.-China competition, I feel, and I'm just sort of asking your thoughts on this maybe, is the fact that TikTok is successful. I mean, whether we're talking about chips, whether we're talking about electric vehicles, it almost seems like part of this is sort of like we have to take down TikTok because more and more Americans prefer TikTok to these American companies, and it's eroding our the economic hegemony, so to speak, and there's kind of like a kneecapping aspect to it. I wonder what you think about that.
No, that's 100% true. The U.S. tech war on China is this key front in the new Cold War, and it comprises another major component of this containment strategy that the U.S. government has taken toward China. And it has different components, right? There's the military aspect of it, of containment, where the U.S. government is like basically encircling it with like U.S. military bases around the South China Sea, and then like just sending an unlimited supply of weapons to arm Taiwan. And then there's this economic isolation component of containment, where the U.S. is targeting Chinese tech companies like TikTok, like Huawei, through the use of sanctions, right? And so the Biden administration wants Chinese ownership to sell TikTok or face a possible ban. And the fundamental issue here, like you said, is that ByteDance is a Beijing-based company, and they've built TikTok, and they've built it to become the most popular and most frequently downloaded app worldwide, right? And so the sanctioning of, the Chinese tech giant Huawei, the moves to ban TikTok, it's all part of this U.S. digital containment strategy of China, and it's trying to block its access to key markets in the U.S. And just like with Huawei, the U.S. is pushing for its allies to ban TikTok. India has already imposed a nationwide ban. It went through within 2020. The UK, the Netherlands, Norway, France, Canada, and Australia, they have all moved to ban the app from government-issued devices. And the U.S. is doing this because in its Made in China 2025 plan, the Communist Party of China basically laid out that technological innovation is central to its economic development. So this strategy held that it was technological advances that would transform China from this kind of semi-peripheral manufacturing hub for cheap goods to one of high-end manufacturing and innovation in the global supply chain, right? And so central to this plan is the goal of China developing its own domestic firms so that it can no longer rely, or it would no longer need to rely on foreign technology imports. So as advances in chip technology kind of revolutionize breakthroughs in other areas, the semiconductor industry is like considered pivotal to this plan. And so these semiconductors or chips are used in consumer electronics, like televisions and computers and game consoles. And China spends more on importing these types of chips than it does oil. And so, recognizing China's reliance on chip manufacturing, Biden has really tried to block access in order to blunt the rise of China's tech sector. So, in October of 2022, Biden introduced all of these like sweeping bans on semiconductor exports to China. And then in January of last year, he reached agreements with like the Netherlands and Japan and other US allies to restrict their exports of chip making equipment to China, right? And so this strategy of tech containment isn't really unique to the current administration. Trump did it too. Trump tried to cut off Huawei's access to Google Music and other smartphone services. And then he later followed up with new sanctions on American technology to China, right? And so, it's important to note that Huawei is Apple's biggest competitor in China. It like recently surpassed the iPhone as the number one smartphone there. But before that, in 2022, Huawei's annual profits had actually plunged by 70% due to US sanctions and like due to the US foreclosing its market access, right? So, this ban or this attempted ban on TikTok is like all part of this larger picture, right? So, of course, the political theater of this like McCarthyite questioning of the TikTok CEO and the threats of a ban of the app, or like Biden trying to force Chinese ownership to sell the app, it should be understood as part of like this larger tech containment strategy, and as like another step toward cutting off Chinese tech from accessing this like key U.S. market. And it's just a strategy where the U.S. is trying to further hinder China's economic development.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, very happy to have you here, Amanda. If you just joining in, we were talking to Amanda Yee, journalist and managing editor of Liberation News. As always, thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.